A Democratic Socialist big upset last night in Florida was just one of several notable threads out of the Sunshine State. Earlier this week, CBS contributor Marc Caputo wrote that Tuesday was the quintessential Florida man primary, with contests that invoke the infamous internet meme. Marc Caputo joins us now to break it all down for us, Florida man style. So, Mark, you wrote that one Republican political consultant told you, quote, "It's like Florida man is having his own election right now." So explain what that meant and what you make of last night's results.
Well, last night's result was sort of the establishment wins, but with an asterisk when Angie Nixon, the Democratic Socialist, had not just a surprise victory, perhaps the biggest Democratic upset in modern Florida political history. It was really surprising. But there was just sort of a lot of lunacy and weirdness. You had Corey Mills, who is the incumbent congressman who lost, who had a restraining order slapped against him by a judge because he had threatened to release sexually explicit material about an ex-girlfriend, was accused of beating another girlfriend, was under, allegedly, federal investigation for various financial irregularities, was accused by veterans groups of a stolen valor offense of exaggerating a military record. That was just in his race. Just to the south, you had Randy Fine, who is the congressman who really has made it a hallmark to say incredibly incendiary things about Palestinians and Muslims. And he wound up being challenged by an avowedly anti-Semitic candidate, Dan Bilzerian, who is a manosphere influencer who released an AI ad of an anti-Semitic song that asked if maybe the Austrian painter had it right. The Austrian painter in that case is Adolf Hitler. You heard that right. You had in a heavily black district in Miami, one of the candidates is the first openly gay black Florida legislator, state legislator, was running. He was accused in a false text from masquerading from a gay rights group, claiming he had AIDS. Again, that was a new thing. In the Southwest Florida, in the race to replace Byron Donalds, who clinched the nomination to be governor on the Republican side, there were a host of Republican candidates. 5 of them, that's right, count them, 5, had run for Congress in other states, including 2 former Congress members, one from North Carolina and another from New York. By the way, none of those 5 carpetbaggers won. So that was sort of different and a little bit unexpected, even though one of them had been endorsed by President Trump. And I'm probably missing one. It was a late night last night, but I think I ticked off the highlights. Byron Donalds, by the way, had a really interesting night because he's Trump endorsed. Yep. He had spent gobs and gobs of money, but he only finished with about 48% of the vote against much lesser known, much less well-funded candidates. And there are signs that his campaign is going to have some trouble. On the other side, though, he's going to be facing David Jolly, who did very well in his primary, finishing with 61% of the vote. But when you actually look at the vote totals that they got, Byron Donalds, even though he got less than half the vote in his primary, nevertheless got more total votes. That's how many more Republicans live in the state, in Florida, than Democrats. And that is sort of an advantage. In the end, elections are about simple things. Who gets more votes? And very often you get more votes by having more voters, and Republicans do have that advantage.
So you mentioned Byron Donalds, and he will square off against David Jolly. So given that Florida is reliably red at this point, you give the edge to Donalds?
Probably. The recent polling, though, shows essentially a tied race, but sometimes we have found historically that polling does have a tendency to miss some Republican voters. There was the slightest of turnout percentage edges by Democrats in this election, but again, wasn't enough to really show that Democrats have enough voters out there. What David Jolly is banking on is that Donalds is relatively weak in his own party, that though Florida is the beating heart of MAGAville, President Trump's approval ratings are down. People aren't happy. They're fed up. They think it's time to move on. They don't like the war in Iran that the president released or unleashed. They don't like the price of gasoline. And so in the Jolly campaign's mind, if he can get about 60% of the independent vote to 40% for Byron Donalds. And if the turnout of Republicans remains relatively low, and lastly, if Jolly can get more crossover voters, that is, more Republicans to vote for him than Byron Donalds has Democrats vote for him, well, then that's how he wins. Now, that's a long way of saying, in Jolly's mind, he's going to try to get more votes than Byron Donalds. It's sort of a fancy way of saying it. You know, everyone's got a plan and they get punched in the mouth. One of the interesting, perhaps the most interesting storyline, though, is Angie Nixon, the Senate candidate who won, because while she didn't campaign as an avowedly, openly Democratic socialist, she didn't have a lot of money, and therefore it wasn't broadcast. Her opponent, Alex Vindman, who was one of the star witnesses in President Trump's Ukraine-related impeachment trial, his first impeachment trial, Vindman ran a terrible campaign, but in the end, Nixon ran a good campaign, was the better candidate, and was able to prevail. And how Jolly and her sort of campaign side by side, the moderate and the Democratic socialist, is something yet to be seen.
Yeah, that's kind of the question that we had. She only recently signed on to be part of the Democratic Socialists. Primary voters are just different, as you know. Now you're the second reporter who covers Florida politics who's told us this was a seismic win for Angie Nixon. The question is, are we missing something? Could she actually conceivably pull this off, or probably not?
I can't forecast that. Historically, socialism is a dirty word in Florida. Remember, Miami has a unique blend of Hispanic voters who come from and hail from countries, or families who have hailed from countries
by the way, Mark,
that have experienced.
By the way, Mark, we asked her about, we pointed that out to her this morning when we had her on CBS Mornings, that you've got people who come from country. You have two sort of challenges she's facing. One, number of Florida voters who come from countries that are socialist in nature, perhaps not in the same way that Democratic Socialists of America are, but they hear that term and it becomes disqualifying. And the third largest number of Jewish voters in the country.
Well, to add something, and I know we're probably running out of time, but I'd be remiss in saying this. The National Democratic Socialists of America released a statement essentially praising Fidel Castro a few days ago. I live in Miami, and I got to tell you, that is a non-starter with a lot of Hispanic voters down there. Cuban, Colombian American, Venezuelan American, and Nicaraguan American. And that's a sizable voting bloc.
All right. Yep.
Mark, really appreciate your analysis.
Always appreciate your analysis, my friend. Thank you.
Thank you.